The very last thing we're going to do in Excel right now is figure out how to define sheets in our document that keep track of the in cell and the out cell for a given cell. And in this slide, I'm going to work through an example using B2 as the given cell and then having adjacent cells A2, B1, C2, and B3. And it's really rather simple for us to identify what an in cell is or an out cell, but we need to teach that to Excel. And the idea is it's just that the difference in the value of those two cells is exactly equal to 1 in a particular order. So what we're going to do is set up a rather long formula in Excel, but that's doing a fairly straightforward computation. We're going to start with B2 minus A2. We're going to do that subtraction, and should that subtraction be equal to 1, then the value in A2 is 1 less than the value in B2, and that's the in cell. And so what we'll do is create a sheet in Excel that keeps track of not the value in A2, but keeps track of the address of A2, so that when we go to the in cell and ask cell B2, what is the in cell, it points me to the address of the cell that is 1 less. That's what we're going to set up in Excel. But I want to explain one more thing about the checking process that we're going to do. So first, we'll check if the difference between B2 and A2 is 1. Next, we'll check if the difference between B2 and B1 is 1. Then we'll check to see if the difference between B2 and C2 is 1. But then we actually need 2 more branches of this if statement. We do want to check to see if the difference between B2 and B3 is equal to 1, because remember that we're applying this formula to a whole bunch of cells that have not yet been filled in. So we don't want to check 3 cells and then just default that this must be the in cell. One reason we might fail to have a subtraction here that's equal to 1 is if both cells are not yet filled in, or if one of these cells is not yet filled in. So it may be the case that A2 really is the in cell for B2, but if A2 is not yet filled in, we could fail that first test, fail these 2 tests, and our program would incorrectly identify that B3 is the in cell. So we really do need 4 checks, 1 for each of the cells. And then what we'll want to do with the final clause is to assume that we just don't know what the in cell is yet. And so instead of putting in a reference to one of these 4 values, we'll put in a reference to a cell that's just not used in the puzzle at all. And sort of like the 0 in the previous cells to indicate not yet filled in, this address that's pointing us outside of the puzzle will be our indication that we just don't know the answer yet. And that will be helpful to us later as we're checking, is this cell lacking an in cell? We'll determine that by seeing that reference that points us outside of the puzzle. So let's get at that in Excel. So I have a tab down here called In Cell, and we're going to fill in that interior first. For now, I've left the boundary because the boundary has a different set of selection criteria because there aren't 4 spots to check. And so you would have to do the boundary, the corners, and the edge cells differently. So I'll leave those in there for you for right now. And what we want to end up filling in here, as you can see from the boundary, are the addresses of the in cells that they're pointing to. And we're using L1 as something that's outside the puzzle. That's our key that we don't know what the in cell is for this particular cell just yet. The other values are pointing to somewhere in the puzzle. We do know what those in cells are. So since we want to occupy this cell with an address in our if clause, I wanted to draw your attention to the address command inside of Excel, because Excel does have the ability to put down the address of a given cell. However, it doesn't quite work the way you might want it to. So for example, we might reference cell A4. That's a cell in this puzzle, A4. However, if we ask Excel for the address of A, 4, it gives us this error message. It doesn't know what to do. And that's because even though Excel is labeling its columns with letters, internally Excel thinks about its columns as being numbered. So it thinks about A as column 1 and B as column 2 and C as column 3. And when we give it this letter as input, it doesn't know what we're talking about. So if I wanted the cell L2 to contain the address of the cell A4, I have to do a silly thing, which is I need to pass it a row number and a column number. So I actually have these out of order for the way that I would talk about an Excel sheet. I need to say I'd like the row of cell A4 to go here and the column of cell A4 to go right here. Now what these commands do, when I ask for the row of A4, it just outputs a 4. So let me show you that right here. Row of A4, it simply outputs a 4. When I ask it for the column of A4, it should output not the letter A, but the number 1. So what we're doing when we type in address of row and column is we're just saying, Excel, convert the row to the number you want it to be of this particular cell and convert the column, more importantly, to the number that you want it to be right here. That makes the input to the address command exactly as Excel wants it, and then it outputs A4 into this spot right here. Now the last thing you'll notice is that it put dollar signs in front of the A and in front of the 4. We may or may not want that, so you do have another optional parameter at the end here. If I put a comma in right after this, it tells me when you don't do anything, I'm going to give you an absolute reference, but you do have these other options to have absolute row relative column. That would be a dollar sign in front of the row, but not in front of the column. Vice versa, dollar sign in front of the column, but not in front of the row. Or option 4 would be relative, don't put dollar signs anywhere. So I think for our purposes, it'll be fine to just leave that option off and have everything be an absolute reference. All right, last but not least, let's go on over to this cell B2 and let's write in the very long formula that we had for determining if this cell is lacking an in cell. So let's write a big long if statement. So if it's the case that sheet 1 in cell B2 minus sheet 1 inside cell A2 is equal to 1. If that subtraction gives us 1, then what we want to do is put the address A2 inside this particular cell. So address of row of A2, column of A2, that's the thing that we want to put down if our logical test is true. And notice right here that now it's saying, okay, you filled in the first 2 chunks of the if statement. Now tell me what you want to do if that test evaluates to false. And if this test evaluates to false, we want to move from cell A2 to cell B1 and do that next subtraction. So in the case that B2 minus A2 is not equal to 1, we want to check B1 to see if this is the in cell. So we do a similar thing, sheet 1, cell B2 minus sheet 1, value in B1. If that's equal to 1, put in this cell the address for row B1, column B1. And if that's false, then we want to move on to cell C2, checking if sheet 1 B2 minus sheet 1 C2 is equal to 1, then we need to put the address of row C2, column C2, and we're almost done. If that's false, we want to do a check on if sheet 1 B2 minus sheet 1 B3 is equal to 1. If that's true, we'd like to provide the address of row B3, column B3. And last but not least, if every single one of those things fails, then we want to put the address of row L1, column L1. That's our indication that we don't know the in cell yet, and we'd like to point outside of the cell. So we're missing a bunch of parentheses here. I believe what we're missing, let's just end them all. And there we go. It's filled something in. It's filled in an L1 for this example, indicating that if I go to the original sheet and I take a look at the cell B2, it should not be clear at this point what the in cell is for that cell. So let's see if that seems correct. Let's go to sheet 1. And it's true that if I look at this cell, I don't really know what its in cell is yet because I don't even have a value in this location. So that seems right for here. Let's go back to our in cell tab. Let's have Excel auto fill in this formula. And we've got a little bit of a problem here, which is that Excel tried to guess a little bit too nicely. And so we don't really have much of a problem. It is still always pointing to cells outside of the file here, but I want them to always point to L1 if there's a problem. And so Excel tried to generalize too much when I dragged that formula on. So let's undo the dragging of that formula. Let's fix what's going on here. Let's make this reference absolute so Excel knows not to change any of those things as it changes other values. And now let's drag that in and fill in everything in our in cells.